1 Timothy chapter 5, picking up in verse 3, and we'll read through verse 16. Here's what the Word of God has to say. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation of good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows. For when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. 1 Timothy 5 begins with a word about the family of faith, then gives lengthy attention to the proper honor. That's the word that is translated in 1 Timothy 5, the proper honor due to widows. Now, this honor is more than just respect and recognition. It includes, like the word very clearly makes plain, that it includes financial support. This command to honor with financial support will also be applied later in the chapter to elders who rule well. Now, most of you are quick to agree to commands to give honor through respect and recognition. In fact, I don't think today that's of any real controversy. Probably those would be easy to amen and to agree and to go along with. However, when you start to connect honor to financial support, many questions immediately arise. So we ask, who qualifies for this support? Who is responsible for providing the support? How much support is required? And how long is this financial support required? Now, these are not inappropriate questions to ask, and they are good questions for the church to wrestle with. These have real practical realities. They have an impact upon the budget. We don't live in a fairy tale world where we can write checks without anything behind them. And so it's right, it's practical, it's responsible, it's wise to ask these questions. Money is a worldly necessity that testifies to spiritual reality. Money only has value in this world. But in this world, money is required to purchase needs and wants. What you give your money to testifies to the spiritual reality of what you treasure. Jesus used a parable to teach this truth in Matthew chapter 13, where he says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. The point he was teaching is that you are willing to sacrifice joyfully all your worldly wealth for what your heart treasures. And what your heart treasures is generally testified to by what you're giving your worldly wealth to. However, the reality of living in a sin-filled, fallen world is that you often treasure and thus honor what is neither a treasure nor worthy of honor, while neglecting to honor what is a true treasure. So from this passage, I want you to see the responsibility of the household of God to honor and support widows. I want you to understand the reason for that honor, and I want us to see some practical instructions that flow out of this passage that teach us how we are to interact with one another and our responsibility to one another. So I'll divide my time today in these ways: responsibility to family, responsibility to church, and then some final practical instructions. Let's begin with responsibility to family. Spiritual and physical family demand responsibility. And we spoke about this quite a bit last Lord's Day. The word that is translated as honor in verse 3, timeo, means it is a word that ascribes to a person of satisfaction, compensation, honor, evaluation, a value, a price. It is to but it means in a practical sense to provide aid or financial assistance, with the implication that this is an appropriate means of showing respect. So I want to be very clear. When Paul says honor widows, he's not saying just be respectful. He's not saying just give kind words. No, he's very clearly, very plainly making the case that the church has a financial responsibility to provide for those who are truly destitute widows in the church. So from the first word of verse 3, there is a command to connect our financial support and assistance with what is worthy of honor. Now, in some ways, you already do this naturally. Most parents give sacrificially for the support of their children because they recognize their children are worthy of sacrifice and they're of great value. Some of you right now with older parents who have significant health needs have sacrificed your time, your resources, your finances to care and to provide for them because you honor them, and you understand that honor has a connection to your financial support of them. I know some of you who have family members who are going through financial crisis have opened your home and have provided for them because you recognize, because they're family, you have a responsibility to provide for them in their moment of needs. Now, in all of these examples, the burden and expense of providing for your family member in need was taken not out of a compulsion, but willingly, because you recognized you had a responsibility for their care. Verses 3 through 16 connect this understanding of responsibility not just to the family of blood kin, but to the family of faith. On our last Lord's Day, I preached verses 1 through 2 and made the case that the local church is a family of faith. Building on that truth, Paul gives instructions on the practical implications of being in a family of faith and begins by teaching the responsibility to members that are in great need. In the first century, widows were a special class because of their limited support options. There was no expectation of retirement in the first century, so most men would work until they died. Women were supported through the family structure. So before marriage, women were supported in the household of their father. At marriage, they then were supported by the household of their husband. In most cases, if their husband died, they were then supported by their sons. And so their support was always connected to the family unit. But the reality of it is, there were always cases that were exceptions, that were unusual in their reality of lack of support. So a widow with no sons and no other family would have no honorable way of supporting herself in the world. The book of Ruth describes the desperate situation that Naomi and her two daughters-in-law find themselves in when Naomi's husband died and then both of her sons die, leaving her and her two daughter-in-laws widows without any source of support. The church's responsibility to one another is like that of blood kin. The widows of the church who have no other source of support should be honored and supported as you would honor and support a family member. The church has a tangible responsibility to the members in need. Now, that's broad, but a secondary reality to that is that responsibility requires proper order. The command is very clear. Honor widows who are truly widows. So financially support those who are truly destitute and in need. As mentioned earlier, such a command immediately elicits questions about the particulars, who and how much. You'll notice that even in the first sentence that gives the command, there is a qualifier. So the qualifier is, in the ESV, it says, who are truly widows. Some of you are more familiar with the King James rendering of this, who are widows indeed, as a distinction there. A widow is a woman who has lost her husband to death and remained unmarried. Now, some widows would continue to enjoy the support of their family. So, though grieved, they would not be destitute or without support. But other widows were left without any support of any source of support, and were both grieved and destitute without any form of support. Paul uses the distinction of truly widows, or as the KJV puts it, widows indeed, to classify this second situation. So he's not talking about just all women who have lost their husband to death. He's talking about specifically women who have lost their husbands to death and have no other legitimate source of support and are truly destitute and in great need. And before moving forward to the particulars of the qualifications for being truly widows, I think there's a need here for us to point out the need for proper order in the church. The qualifications for widows worthy of support there's some huge assumptions here. It assumes that the church has properly ordered elders and overseers, leadership that has provided discipline in a well-ordered membership that can testify to these qualifications. So these qualifications for who qualifies and who doesn't qualify assume that the church is well-ordered in its leadership, in its discipline, and in its membership. Like so many other things in this world, what happens downstream is dependent upon what happens upstream. And friends, I just want to tell you over and over again, we come to this, the church will not be able to obey the command of chapter 5 unless it's obeyed the commands of chapter 3. And so there's a sense here, friends, that you can't just lift this out and disconnect it from the rest of the letter and say we ought to do this. No, we need to be obedient all the way through. Be obedient to our leadership structure. Be obedient to our membership structure so that we can be obedient to these things as well. In verses 9 through 15, Paul gives the requirements and restrictions for those who should be enrolled to receive church support. Now, the enrollment requirements in verses 9 through 10 are these. Women had to be 60 years or older. There had to be a testimony of faithfulness in marriage. And there had to be a testimony of good works. And then he even gives some particulars of those good works where he says they raised children, they demonstrated hospitality, they served the saints. I think it's particularly focused on serving the members of the church, and then cared for the afflicted. I think that's more a broad sense of caring for those who are in crisis, whether in the church or out of the church, and devoted to good works, serving God. And then he gives some enrollment restrictions. He says, no young women. And he says because they're not prepared for a life totally devoted to the church ministry, and it would be better for them to be about the labor of marriage, children, and home. And we'll speak about that later. And he says the other restriction is any woman who has support or should have support. That's an interesting distinction there. Has support or should have support from family. That would be verse 16. Being enrolled is to be put on a list. And widows who were put on the list were to be supported by the church. And so the idea there is that this is not an ambiguous sense of just general support for anyone who requested. No, this was a particular identifying who needed it, identifying who qualified it, and then those who were identified and put on the list were identified as being worthy of the support, set apart for this support, and those on the list were expected to continue to devote themselves to the household of God in their ministry and in their service. Brothers and sisters, we have a responsibility to the family of faith. Secondly, we all have a responsibility to the church. Now, there's some things I think that this passage teaches us about the church. First is that the church must honor what honors the Lord. Now, modern readers may find this passage and its commands to be unsettling, in part because the specifics of these commands do not fit well into modern expectations of no standards, no judgments, or expectations. So we're living in a world, and listen, you can find the examples of this in just about everywhere you go, where there is an expectation, there's no standards, no judgment, no requirements. And so whatever you want to do, you ought to be able to do. And these restrictions and these requirements don't fit well with that modern sense of rejecting such things. An unfaithful, a wrong reading of this text would be to teach this text is saying the church is responsible for financially supporting all women who have been widowed. Or that the church's primary task and role is to provide the welfare assistance for those in need. Now, the church may find it good and right to provide welfare and assistance to those in need, but it's not teaching that's the primary task of the church, and it's certainly not teaching that it's the command of the church to provide assistance to all women who have been widowed. The primary focus of the church is the gospel. What dictates the church's efforts is the gospel and the word of God, not cultural expectations or demands. Those who were eligible to be put on the list were women who demonstrated a lifelong testimony of gospel service and devotion. Now, that's the positive side. Those who were eligible to be put on the list were women who were widows, who had no other source of support, and had demonstrated a lifelong devotion to the gospel, to the work of the gospel, evidence of salvation in their life. That's the positive side of saying that. The negative side of saying that is what the modern culture would not celebrate, and that is that this is not a command requiring the support of those who have no testimony of gospel service and devotion to the Lord and who are in need. Now, here's the reality, friends. There's a lot of need in the world. There has always been a lot of need in the world. And particularly if you've lived wickedly and secularly, sometimes that produces in your life even greater need. Now, there may be a sense of support for just gracious giving and kindness that can be given, but this passage is not that passage we would go to for that. This passage is talking about those who are to be supported completely financially by the church, and there's those who have been widowed, who have no other support, and have demonstrated a historical testimony of gospel service, a historical testimony of evidence of salvation, not just simply those who find themselves in great need. Certainly, the church shows kindness and grace to those in need. This would include widows regardless of their testimony. However, the commands of chapter 5 relate not to the service of the church to the community, but the honor of the church to the gospel. That's the issue here. The church is honoring and supporting the testimony of the gospel here. The honor and support commanded to widows in chapter 5 is a reflection of what the church loves and honors. These women are not receiving a handout. They're not receiving the honor that is, they are receiving the honor that is a worthy response to their testimony of faithfulness and devotion that they continue to give to the Lord and to the church. What the church loves, it will honor and support. So let the testimony of the church be that it honors what the Lord honors. Testimonies that are worthy of honor. And secondly, the church honors established testimonies. The women who were to be enrolled to receive support from the church were expected to give the rest of their lives to the service of the church. So this was not just receiving support with no expectations. There was an expectation that they were going to devote themselves to good works and devotion to the work of the church. Part of this devotion was an expectation that they would remain single. Now, this is not a teaching that singleness is preferred or even godlier. This is a recognition that these women would give their hearts, their minds, and their service totally to the Lord. So verses 11 and 12 are a restriction against younger widows from being enrolled because they are likely to remarry and abandon the commitment made to the church. So that's the issue here. Those who have been supported by the church, there's an expectation that they're devoted to the church, and the restriction of younger women was they're not quite ready for that type of commitment. The expectation for future ministry was founded on the testimony of their current ministry. The requirements of verses 9 and 10 are not things that someone wishing to receive support from the church should start doing. The requirements of verses 9 and 10 were the marks of a well-established testimony known and observed by the church. There is a temptation to be more excited by recent decisions and actions than constant testimony. We all can appreciate that. Something new always tends to catch our attention. But let the testimony of the church be that it honors and celebrates the long testimony of consistent faithfulness to the Lord. Now, there's responsibility to family. There's responsibility to the church. But I also think this passage teaches us some practical instructions, and I want to identify them for you here. The first is that the first source of welfare is the family. Now, friends, we're living many, many years past the first century. And there's a lot of things that are different culturally, particularly in financial support in our world than in their world. But this principle still remains. Why? Because the Word of God is true yesterday, today, and tomorrow, because God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The primary source of welfare is the family. The church is commanded to support the true widows who have no other source of support. However, the church's support is not God's intended way. In other words, this is a response to just the understanding that there are things in this world that are not as they should be. Support from the church is a response of grace when the regular means of support are not available. Paul makes this point 3 times. So first he gives it as a command to families. Look at 1 Timothy 5, verse 4. He says, "But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God." It's a command to families. It's God-honoring, it's God-pleasing for you to care for your relatives. In verse 8, there's a judgment. A pronouncement of judgment against unfaithful families. So he says, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." In other words, he's treating his own family worse than what unbelievers treat their families. And then, in verse 16, there's the command to Christian women. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Now, friends, we ought to be thankful for all avenues of help that provide for those in need. I'm not here to diminish or to give some critical word about sources of help other than the family. The church certainly has a mandate to provide for the widows who are truly widows and without any other source of provision. Those things remain. And though God uses the church to care for these in need, the family remains the God-ordained source of help and provision. So let's be clear. It pleases God for children and grandchildren to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. That's what verse 4 says. It is a warning to us that those who refuse to assist their own family members deny the faith and behave as an unbeliever. And as verse 16 teaches, it is not right for the church to be burdened by responsibilities rightly borne by the family. Secondly, devotion to the church is a serious commitment. Reading this passage, it's easy to focus in on the support mechanism. So those who get to receive it and maybe the benefits that it brings, but throughout the teaching, and particularly in the restrictions, Paul makes very clear that there are some dangers, there are some warnings that need to be wrestled with in receiving this support. Verse 12, I just would draw your attention to it, is a serious warning. He says, and so he says, let me back up, verse 11, but refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Verse 5 points to the expectation of a widow who has devoted herself to the ministry of the church when it says, she who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. That's her labor, that's her tasks. Verses 11, 12, 13, and 14 and 15 identify two dangers of receiving this support. First, receiving it and being unprepared for the commitment of devotion that it's required. And secondly, being disconnected from purposeful labor. Now, part of the restriction against enrolling younger women is that Paul says they're not prepared for the commitment. Verse 11 does not prohibit younger women from receiving support from the church simply because they're young. I want to be very careful here. The age issue is not the issue. The restriction against younger women is a recognition that they're not prepared for the restrictions of the calling. Now, the word that is translated as passion in verse 11, it means the experiencing of strong physical desires, particularly of a sexual nature. Now, desiring sexual union in marriage is not sin. In fact, that's evidenced in verse 14 where Paul says, I encourage them to marry and have children. So it's not the desire for sex inside of a marriage union that's sin here. The issue is being drawn away from the commitment made to the Lord. It is good and honorable thing to devote yourself to the service of the Lord in His church, but do not enter into this devotion lightly. That's the point here. Just don't see the support as something good and don't count the cost of the devotion. The second warning is being disconnected from purposeful labor. Now, friends, we don't have time today, but there's a word here for all of you in this one. Paul identifies three sinful behaviors in verse 13. Idlers, gossips, and busybodies. All three of these were related to being disconnected from purposeful work or labor. Now, I think there's an application here for all of the church, both male and female. The first century had no concept of retirement, so there was no expectation that there would ever be a day in your life free of labor. You were born, and you worked, and then you died. Purposeful labor is God honoring. We were created to work. Now, the sinful, broken reality of this world is that often work is unpleasant and seen as a negative, but when you read the account of the creation of God putting Adam and Eve in the garden, they were in the goodness of the garden before the curse of sin. They worked. They collected the fruit that God had provided for them to eat. And so there's labor there, and it wasn't seen as negative. It wasn't seen as burdensome. That only came in Genesis 3 with the curse of sin. Purposeful labor is God honoring, and being free from it creates opportunities for sinful behaviors that gives the adversary, as verse 14 says, occasion to slander. Slander the church, slander the gospel. Now, I want to be very clear here. No Christian should have the goal to be an idler. Thank you, brother. I'm going to say it again. No Christian should have it as their goal to be an idler. Now, here's the scary reality. In our first world reality, idling is seen as something desirable. But that's not biblical. And Paul connects being an idler with other sinful behaviors like gossiping and being a busybody. Wherever you are in life, even if you have reached the point where you are retired from labor that's required to put groceries on your table, praise God for that. I'm not knocking that. But wherever you are in life, if you're just getting started, if you're getting close to retirement, you can see it. I'm a little bit desirous of that moment. If you've reached retirement, wherever you are in life, give yourself to purposeful labor and God-honoring labor. Do not give yourself to being an idler. Listen, if you've been blessed with retirement and you no longer have to get up tomorrow morning and go to a job, that just means you're set free to be about purposeful labor that doesn't earn a paycheck. But you've not been called, I'm telling you, you've not been called to being an idler. Because being an idler creates all kinds of other dysfunctional things. For the true widows, the support of the church was not simply to set the women free from the demand of labor, but to set them free to the labor of the Lord. And Paul understood there's a danger here if you just can disconnect them from purposeful labor, particularly young women. You create an environment that's ripe for all kinds of dysfunctional things that gives the adversary, gives Satan an opportunity to bring accusations against the church. Thirdly, this one doesn't sit well with our modern world either. Raising children is God-honoring labor. Marriage is good and God-honoring. Purposeful work is healthy and God-honoring. And Paul reminds the church in verse 14 of the goodness and honor of marriage, raising children and managing a home. He says, "So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander." So much of the secular messaging today is contrary to these things. To young adults, and if you're a young adult here today, I suspect you've received this messaging in 1,000 different forms. But to young adults, the messaging is to delay marriage as long as you possibly can. So wait until after you finish college. Wait until after you get your master's degree, or maybe after you get a PhD. Just wait until you finish school. Or after you wait until you've got a job and you've established yourself and you're sort of on your own 2 feet. Or wait until after you start earning some money and able to save. Wait until after, this is a secular worldview, wait until after you've lived together a little while and see if you really like each other. And so many other things. The real messaging is just avoid marriage altogether. Friends, that's contrary to the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview celebrates marriage as a beautiful testimony of the gospel between Christ and the church. It celebrates the fruit of marriage, children, and the gift of children. And we as a church need to articulate in a broken, messed up world that hates marriage and is pushing back against marriage that no, marriage is beautiful, marriage is good, marriage is honorable, and it's a worthy labor to give yourself to. And friends, I'm just telling you, those of you who are parents of young adults, we need to change our tune. We need to quit saying wait until. That's coming from a secular worldview that's not biblical. We need to say, seek after a mate that loves the Lord. Oh, seek after a mate that will join you in serving Christ in his church. Marry and raise children and honor the Lord through your family. The messaging on children is no better. The world says children interrupt your plans, so hold off on having babies. The secular world says that children will stop your career. They'll stop your career, your carefree life. They'll hinder your career advancement. And the subtle messaging is that children mess up a good thing. You know what the biblical worldview is? Children are a good thing. Oh, they keep you up at night. Do I hear amen? Oh, y'all don't remember? Thank you, brother. There were years that I always had a snot stain on my shoulder right there. I wore it with pride. They make you tired. Mamas and daddies with young children in the house, they will break you down. And yeah, it does change your career path. It does mean that you don't think about yourself only. It does change your world. But we need to say it over. In fact, we need to say it louder and louder because we're fighting against a secular world that's shouting. Children are good. They are a blessing of God. The messaging on managing the household is no better either. The secular world says you can hire all the household tasks out. The secular world says managing your household is a demeaning work and that you should pursue more worldly celebrated goals. But friends, we must affirm over and over and over again that marriage is God-honoring. This includes marrying again even after the death of your spouse. It's God-honoring. Raising children is God-honoring and a worthy labor. Raising children should be the hoped-for desire, not the avoided burden. Managing your household is God-honoring and has eternal impact. It is more important than any secular celebrated job will ever be. And so Paul says, listen, rather than being an idler and gossip and busybody, get married, have children, and manage your household. It's worthy labor. It's often been said the best testimony of what you treasure and honor is not what you say, but how you spend your money and how you spend your time. One of the most unappreciated testimonies of the home and church is our annual budgets. What's getting the lion's share of your honor and support? In my time in ministry, I pastored 3 churches. And in all of those churches, I've not had a widow without any other source of support and in need of the church to provide for her. However, I have witnessed widows who demonstrated a testimony of faithfulness and devotion to the Lord, worthy of honor. When I first came to pastor Central, there was a widow in our church who, even though at that time she was already advanced in age, was still very active in the ministry of the church. She made monthly connections with our college students. She was very active in our women's ministries and senior adult ministries. She was a Sunday school teacher. And she was a faithful attender of Lord's Day worship. She also had a prayer ministry that very few knew about. She kept a notebook. She kept a list of prayer needs of her family, of her friends, of her church, her pastors. And she would sit in her recliner a couple of times a day and work through that prayer notebook and pray. As the years passed and her age advanced, it brought about in her life increasing restrictions. When her eyesight grew too dim to write, she had to stop sending letters and communication to our college students. When she gave up driving, she lost the ability to teach Sunday school and be present and active in so many of the ministries that happen on campus here at the church. However, at every moment where her world was restricted, She adjusted her plans and found a new way to minister. When she lost the ability to drive and couldn't teach here anymore, she started a Bible study in her home and began to teach the Bible to her neighbors. At the very end of her life, she was mostly restricted to her recliner. Almost every ministry she had ever undertaken was no longer physically possible for her, but one. Beside her recliner was that prayer notebook. And sitting in that recliner most of the day, every day, she'd work through that notebook. Many of you she prayed for, whether you knew it or not. She prayed for her lost family members. She prayed for the needs of our community. Those of you who are not being faithful to the church, she was praying for you. She was praying for me. I don't know this to be true, but I wonder if she longed to return to the days of greater activity. She had been so vital and active in her younger years. But the greatest testimony I witnessed in her was the tenacity of faithfulness, of her laboring in prayer sitting in that recliner. That, my friends, is a testimony of service to the church that should be, that ought to be, that must be honored. That's the idea here, that the church celebrates that kind of ministry, that the church honors that kind of ministry, a testimony that's been borne out not over a week or a year, but over a lifetime, that's faithful all the way to the last breath, a testimony of service and worthy of honor in their love and devotion for Christ and His church.
Thank you for listening to All for the Kingdom, a weekly podcast of my preaching ministry. For more sermons, blog posts, and other related content, go to bensmithsenior.org. That's bensmithsr.org. I am the pastor of Central Baptist Church in Waycross, Georgia. I would love for you to join us this coming Sunday at 201 Ava Street here in Waycross. Our morning services begin at 10:30 a.m. For more information about Central Baptist, go to cbcwaycross.org. Again, thank you for listening, and until the Lord returns, let us live each moment all for the King and all for the kingdom.